Chapter 1. The Baited Trap. The streets of Mordheim stretched out before us like a decaying labyrinth, twisted and broken. The very air reeked of death and despair, the ground beneath my feet uneven with the bones of the damned and the rubble of a city long forgotten by time. In this forsaken place there was no sound save for the distant creak of sagging buildings, groaning under the weight of their own ruin. It was too quiet, too still. Carl walked beside me, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. His every step was measured, his eyes scanning the shadows for the inevitable threat that lurked within. He had grown used to the constant danger of this place, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He knew something wasn't right. And so did I. "Feels off, doesn't it?" Carl muttered, breaking the silence between us. I nodded, my eyes narrowed. "There's always something waiting in this city, Carl, and it's always watching." We passed the remains of an old tavern, its sign long rotted away, the door hanging loose on its hinges. I could smell the faintest trace of life human, and more than one. They thought themselves hidden, crouching in the darkness, but to me their fear was as clear as a bell. "They're waiting for us," I said, a smile creeping onto my lips. "Mercenaries, most likely." Carl turned to me, his brow furrowed. "Mercenaries? Here." "Even in this hellscape, men will do anything for gold," I replied, my hand tightening around the hilt of my sword. "They don't care about the dangers of Mordheim. They care about the profit." The smell of sweat and steel grew stronger as we moved into a narrow alley. My senses were sharp, each step I took bringing us closer to the trap I knew was waiting. Whoever these mercenaries were, they believed they had the upper hand. Fools. We rounded a corner, and that's when I heard the faint scrape of metal on stone. It was almost imperceptible, but to me it might as well have been a shout. The alley suddenly felt tighter, the buildings leaning in as if to smother us. "Stop," I ordered, raising a hand to halt Carl in his tracks. He froze, his gaze following mine. I nodded toward the rooftops. It was subtle, but I could see them, the faint glint of crossbow bolts aimed down at us from the shadows. Hidden well, but not well enough. Above, at least a dozen men were perched like vultures, waiting for the signal to unleash their barrage. "They think they've trapped us," I said softly, my voice laced with amusement. "And what do we do?" Carl asked, his grip tightening on his sword. "We're outnumbered." I smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach my eyes. "We show them their mistake." As if on cue, a man stepped out from the opposite end of the alley, his figure shrouded in a tattered black cloak. His armor was well worn, and his eyes gleamed with a mixture of greed and arrogance. This was no ordinary sellsword, this was a captain. And he had the audacity to think he could claim my head for coin. "Frich Von Haas," the man called, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I've heard tales of you. A vampire knight, a creature of the night, feared by the living and the dead alike." His eyes shifted to Carl, barely acknowledging the mortal at my side. I could see the disdain in his gaze, the arrogance of a man who thought he'd already won. "But here's the thing," Monster the captain continued, his voice dripping with confidence. "Even you can die, and there's a bounty on your head that's too rich to pass up." I chuckled darkly, stepping forward. "Vultan, isn't it?" I asked, watching as the captain's eyes widened, surprised that I knew his name. "I've heard of you too. A man of ambition, with little regard for what stands in his way. But let me be clear about one thing, Vultan." I unsheathed my sword, the sound of steel ringing through the alley like a death knell. "Your mistake wasn't coming after me. It was thinking you could survive the attempt." For a moment there was silence. Then, with a sharp whistle from Vultan, the rooftops erupted in a flurry of movement. Crossbows fired, bolts raining down from above like deadly hail. But I was already moving. With supernatural speed, I dodged the first volley, leaping toward the nearest building. My fingers found purchase on the cracked stone, and I vaulted up, my sword cutting through the air. The first mercenary barely had time to scream before my blade cleaved through his chest, sending him crashing to the street below. Chaos erupted. Men shouted, scrambling to reload their crossbows as I moved through them like a shadow, each swing of my sword a blur of death. I relished their fear, felt it thick in the air as they realized they had vastly underestimated me. Below, Carl fought fiercely, his sword clashing with Valten's men as they rushed him. He was outnumbered, but he held his ground, cutting down the first mercenary that came too close. His loyalty was unshakable, his skill undeniable. Even surrounded, he did not falter. Valten watched from the far end of the alley, his eyes narrowing as his men fell one by one. He had underestimated us both. I made my way across the rooftops, dispatching the last of the crossbowmen with ease. Blood soaked the stones and the air was filled with the sound of dying men. I leapt back down into the alley, landing with a thud as I turned to face Valten. "You should have stayed hidden," I said, wiping the blood from my blade. "Now you'll pay the price." Valten sneered, drawing his own sword. "You're not walking out of this city alive, vampire. There's more at play here than you realize." I raised an eyebrow. "More? Tell me then, who hired you?" Valten's eyes flickered, just for a moment, but I saw the hesitation. "Someone with more power than you'll ever know." I smiled coldly. "We'll see." With that, we charged at each other, our blades meeting in a clash of steel and sparks. The battle had only just begun. Chapter 2. The Mercenary Leader. Valten's blade met mine with a sharp clang, sending sparks into the air as we locked eyes. His expression was one of grim determination, but there was something else there too, fear, lurking just beneath the surface. He had heard the stories. He knew what I was capable of. Yet here he stood, hoping that skill and steel would be enough to take my head. It wouldn't be. "You fight well for a dead man," Valten growled, pushing against my sword with all his strength. I laughed, the sound low and cold. "And you fight like a man who thinks he still has a future." With a sharp twist, I broke the lock, sending him stumbling back. He recovered quickly, his sword raised again, but I could see the strain in his movements. He was strong, skilled, even, but he wasn't used to fighting something like me. Few men were. Around us, the sounds of battle still echoed. Carl fought with the remaining mercenaries, his blade moving with precision as he cut through their ranks. He had taken down 2 already, but they kept coming, desperate to overwhelm him. I could feel his fatigue, hear the strain in his breath. He was mortal, after all, bound by the limits of his flesh. Valten, however, seemed to think I was bound by the same constraints. "You're not invincible, vampire," he spat, lunging forward again, his blade aimed at my throat. I sidestepped easily, bringing my sword down in a swift arc. Valten barely managed to parry the blow, the force of it driving him back a few paces. His chest rose and fell heavily, sweat dripping down his brow. He was tiring. "You think you can kill me, Valten?" I asked, circling him slowly, my sword gleaming in the faint light of the shattered comet overhead. "Do you truly believe you can take my head and collect your bounty?" His eyes flickered with doubt, but he didn't answer. Instead, he charged again, his movements more frantic, more desperate. I could feel his anger, his frustration. He was a man used to winning, to dominating the battlefield. But now he faced something beyond his understanding. I let him come. Let him swing his blade wildly, trying to find an opening. His strikes were strong but sloppy, each one missing its mark as I moved effortlessly out of his reach. "I know why you're here," I said, my voice calm, almost bored. "You think this will make you rich. You think you can leave Mordheim and live a life of luxury after this?" Volton snarled, swinging again. "Shut your mouth." I easily blocked his strike, the force of it reverberating up my arm. "But you're wrong. You won't leave this city. Not alive." His eyes flared with anger, and he struck again, harder this time. The blow was wild, uncontrolled, and I dodged it easily, stepping inside his guard. Before he could react, I drove my fist into his chest, sending him crashing into the wall of the narrow alley. He gasped for breath, his sword clattering to the ground as he struggled to stay on his feet. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, and I could hear the faint wheeze of a cracked rib. "Tell me who sent you," I said, stepping closer, my sword still raised. "Who put the price on my head?" Volton glared at me, wiping the blood from his mouth. "You'll get nothing from me, vampire." I sighed, shaking my head. "Loyal to the end, are we?" "Admirable, but foolish." Behind me, the sounds of the fight were dying down. I glanced over my shoulder to see Carl standing over the last of the mercenaries, his sword stained with blood. He wiped his brow, looking to me for direction. I turned back to Volton, my eyes narrowing. "I'll ask you one more time. Who sent you?" He spat blood onto the ground at my feet, his defiance still burning despite the pain. "You think you're untouchable, but there are powers greater than you. Powers that want you dead." I frowned, stepping closer until I loomed over him. "What powers?" Volton chuckled darkly, even as blood dripped from his lips. "You think you're the only vampire lord in Mordheim, Von Haas? You're not, and one of them wants you out of the way." I felt a cold, slow anger bloom in my chest at his words. A rival. Of course. I had come here to test myself, to prove my strength against the horrors of this cursed city. But now I realized I was not the only one with ambitions. Someone had seen me as a threat. "And who is this lord?" I demanded, my voice low and dangerous. Volton's smile widened, even as he struggled to breathe. "You'll find out soon enough. He'll come for you, and when he does, you'll wish you'd never stepped foot in Mordheim." I stared down at him, my mind racing. So this wasn't just about gold. There were forces at play in this city, forces that I hadn't fully grasped. I had thought I was here to test my limits, to see how far I could push myself against the dangers of Mordheim. But now it was clear that someone else was pulling the strings. Someone powerful. Someone who feared what I could become. I narrowed my eyes at Volton. "Then you've outlived your usefulness." Before he could react, I drove my sword through his chest, silencing him for good. His body slumped to the ground, his eyes still wide with defiance even in death. I pulled my sword free and turned to Carl, who had been watching silently. "What did he say?" Carl asked, wiping the blood from his sword. "Someone else wants me dead," I replied, sheathing my blade. "A vampire lord here in Mordheim." Carl frowned. "Do you know who?" "Not yet," I said, my voice cold. "But I will." Carl nodded, his face grim. "What now?" I looked around at the bodies of the fallen mercenaries, the alley still thick with the scent of blood and death. This was no longer just a test of my strength. This was a game of power, of dominance. And I wasn't going to be anyone's pawn. "We dig deeper," I said, turning my gaze toward the dark streets ahead. "Find out who's behind this, and then we make them regret ever crossing me." Carl sheathed his sword, falling into step beside me as we moved further into the heart of Mordheim. The city's shadows seemed to close in around us, but I welcomed them. Let them come. Let them try. I would see every last one of them fall. Chapter 3 closing in. The stench of blood and desperation hung thick in the air, the alley now littered with the bodies of Volton's men. But we had no time to savor the victory. From the rooftops and the narrow streets surrounding us, more footsteps echoed faint, but growing louder. The mercenaries were regrouping. I could sense them closing in like a pack of wolves, their numbers growing with every step. "They're not done with us," Carl muttered, his voice tight. Blood trickled down his arm from a shallow wound, and his breathing was labored. Mortal as he was, fatigue had begun to set in, and the relentless waves of enemies were taking their toll. I turned to him, my senses sharper than ever. "No, they're not," I said, scanning the shadows. "They've learned from their first mistake. This time they won't come at us blindly. They'll try to corner us, choke the life out of us with sheer numbers." Carl wiped the blood from his sword, his eyes narrowing. "We need to get out of here." "We're not running," I growled. "We make our stand here." But even as I spoke, I knew the situation was growing more precarious. The alleyway that had once offered some semblance of shelter now felt like a trap. The walls pressed in on either side, leaving little room to maneuver. And though I could fight for hours, days, if necessary, I knew that Carl couldn't. His mortal body had its limits. My gaze shifted to the rooftops. That's where they were. I could hear them moving crossbowmen, preparing for another volley. They thought they could pin us down, fire from above while their comrades moved in for the kill. It was a clever tactic, one designed for trapping stronger foes. But I was not their prey. "Carl," I said, my voice low and commanding. "Hold them here. Draw them in. I'll deal with the ones up top." Carl's eyes flicked up toward the rooftops, then back to me. His face was pale, but he nodded without hesitation. "Just don't take too long." I grinned, showing the faint gleam of my fangs. "I won't." Before he could respond, I launched myself upward, my body moving with the speed and grace of a predator. My fingers gripped the jagged stone of the alley wall as I climbed swiftly toward the rooftops, the sounds of the mercenaries above growing louder with each step. They were close now. Too close. I crested the edge of the roof, and there they were, 4 of them, crossbows in hand, aiming down into the alley below where Carl waited. They didn't see me at first, their focus entirely on the fight below. But that would change soon enough. Without a sound, I moved toward the first man, my blade slicing through the air as I severed his spine with one swift motion. He fell to the ground with a strangled cry, his crossbow clattering beside him. The others turned, their eyes wide with shock and fear. But it was too late. I was already on them. The second man raised his crossbow, fumbling to aim, but my sword was faster. I drove it through his chest, feeling the satisfying crack of bone as he collapsed. The third mercenary tried to flee, his feet slipping on the wet tiles of the roof, but I caught him by the throat, lifting him off the ground with ease. "Where do you think you're going?" I hissed, my grip tightening. He choked, his eyes bulging as he struggled to speak. Please." I didn't let him finish. With a flick of my wrist, I snapped his neck and tossed him aside like a broken doll. The last man had already dropped his crossbow, backing away slowly, his face pale with terror. I could smell his fear, sharp and acrid. He knew he was already dead. "Please. I didn't want to do this. I'm just following orders," he stammered, his voice shaking. "Then you should have chosen better orders," I said coldly, before driving my sword through his heart. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle over the rooftop. Below, I could hear Carl fighting off the remaining mercenaries in the alley, his sword clashing with theirs, the sounds of battle echoing off the walls. He was holding his own for now. I wiped the blood from my blade and turned, leaping down from the rooftop to rejoin Carl. As my boots hit the ground, I saw him locked in combat with 2 of Volton's men, his movements slower now, his breathing ragged. He was a skilled fighter, but fatigue was catching up to him. With a single swing of my sword, I ended the lives of the 2 men, their bodies crumpling at Carl's feet. He glanced at me, wiping the sweat from his brow. "That took long enough," he muttered, though I could hear the relief in his voice. I gave him a sharp look, but there was no time for banter. The footsteps were growing louder again, more mercenaries, closing in from the far end of the alley. I could see them now, their figures emerging from the shadows, their eyes glinting with murderous intent. "They're not giving up," Carl said, stepping back to stand beside me, his sword still raised. "No," I replied, my voice grim. "They won't stop until we're dead." But even as I said the words, I felt a surge of anger rise within me. These mercenaries were nothing more than pawns, sent to die for a cause they didn't even understand. Someone was pulling the strings, someone who thought they could eliminate me with mere hired blades. They were wrong. And soon they would learn the cost of underestimating me. "They think they can overwhelm us," I said, my voice cold. "But they don't know who they're dealing with." Carl glanced at me, his eyes filled with determination. "Then let's show them." With a roar, I charged forward, my sword slicing through the air as I cut down the first of the mercenaries. They had thought they could corner us, trap us like prey. But I was no prey. I was the hunter, and I would make them pay for their arrogance. The alley was narrow, the walls pressing in on either side, but I moved with deadly precision, cutting down any who dared stand in my way. Blood splattered the cobblestones as I fought, each strike of my blade filled with fury. Beside me, Carl fought with equal determination, his sword flashing in the dim light. We moved as one, cutting through the remaining mercenaries with ruthless efficiency. They had thought their numbers would be enough. They were wrong. Soon the alley was silent once more, the bodies of Vultan's men lying in heaps around us. The scent of blood hung heavy in the air, but the fight was over. For now. I sheathed my sword and turned to Carl, who was leaning against the wall, catching his breath. "That was close," he said between gasps. I nodded, though my thoughts were elsewhere. Vultan was dead, his men defeated, but his final words echoed in my mind. Someone else wanted me dead. A vampire lord, one with enough influence to send mercenaries after me in this cursed city. I would find out who. And then I would make them regret ever crossing me. "Let's move," I said, my voice cold. "This isn't over." Carl nodded, pushing himself off the wall as we disappeared deeper into the labyrinth of Mordheim. Chapter 4: A Turn of Fortune. The sounds of battle filled the narrow alley, but the tide was beginning to shift against us. I could feel it. The mercenaries came in waves, relentless and driven, as if they thought they could wear me down through sheer numbers alone. Fools. But even fools could become dangerous when they refused to die. Carl fought beside me, his sword arm slower now, the fatigue showing in every strike. Blood dripped from a deep gash along his side, staining his armor, but still he fought. I admired his tenacity, mortal though he was. He never flinched. He knew no fear. Or if he did, he buried it deep beneath his sense of duty. His loyalty was fierce, unwavering. But loyalty wouldn't save him if we didn't turn this around. "Stay sharp," I growled as I deflected a mercenary's blade, spinning to sever the man's throat in one fluid motion. "They're trying to close us in." I've noticed Carl shot back, his breath ragged. He sidestepped a clumsy strike from another attacker, driving his sword into the man's chest with a grunt. His movements were slowing, though. Each attack seemed to take a little more effort. He wouldn't last much longer at this rate. Neither would these mercenaries if I had my way. The alley grew tighter the further we fought, its walls looming on either side like the jaws of some great beast, closing in to devour us. I could feel the presence of more mercenaries gathering just out of sight, crossbowmen, perhaps, waiting for their moment to strike. But something deeper nagged at me. This wasn't just another mindless skirmish. There was a cold calculation to this attack. The mercenaries weren't just here to kill me, they were trying to trap me, to choke off every escape route until there was no way out. It was a strategy far beyond the brutish tactics I had expected from mere sellswords. Someone else was guiding them, and it wasn't just Vultan. On your left, Carl's shout brought me back to the fight, just in time to block a heavy blow aimed at my head. The mercenary snarled, his face twisted with the fury of a man who thought himself close to victory. Too slow, I growled, spinning out of his reach and driving my sword through his gut. The man's eyes went wide with shock before he crumpled to the ground, his blood pooling beneath him. I stepped back, surveying the battlefield, or what little of it I could see from the confines of the alley. The bodies of fallen mercenaries lay strewn around us, but more were coming. Always more. They moved with purpose, surrounding us, closing in. I could see the crossbowmen now, shifting into position above us. The rooftops were lined with them, their weapons trained on me and Carl, waiting for the perfect moment to unleash their barrage. We needed to break free. Now. Carl, I called, catching his eye. We're not holding here. We move. He blinked, confused, his sword still raised defensively. Move where? Up, I snarled, pointing to the rooftops. Follow me. Without waiting for a response, I leapt toward the nearest wall, my fingers finding purchase on the crumbling stone. The mercenaries below shouted in confusion as I scaled the wall with ease, my vampiric strength allowing me to climb faster than they could react. Carl hesitated for a moment, then followed, though his ascent was slower, his mortal body struggling against the weight of exhaustion and injury. As I reached the rooftop, I was met with the sight of half a dozen crossbowmen, all of them turning to face me, their weapons loaded and ready. For a brief moment they froze, unsure of what to do now that their prey had come to them. I didn't give them time to think. With a roar, I launched myself into the nearest group, my sword flashing through the air as I cut them down. The first fell with barely a scream, his throat slashed open, while the second crumpled as I drove my blade through his chest. The others scrambled to reload their crossbows, but they were too slow. I was upon them in seconds, their blood staining the stone beneath my feet. The remaining mercenaries on the rooftop began to retreat, realizing too late that they were no match for me. I felt a grim satisfaction as I hunted them down, cutting them down one by one. These men were nothing more than pawns in someone else's game, but that didn't mean they didn't deserve to die for their foolishness. Below, Carl had finally reached the rooftop, though I could see the pain etched on his face. He was struggling to keep up, his movements sluggish, but he wasn't backing down. He never did. As I finished off the last of the crossbowmen, I turned to Carl. We have to end this. Now. He nodded, though I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. Agreed. But how? I glanced down at the street below, where the remaining mercenaries were gathering for another assault. They still thought they could win this. They thought they had us surrounded. But I knew something they didn't. They had overextended themselves. They had thrown everything they had into this one final push, and now they were spread too thin. They think they have the advantage, I said, a cold smile tugging at my lips. But they've left themselves open. I could see it now, the flaw in their strategy. They were focused on trapping us, on cutting off our escape, but in doing so, they had spread themselves too far across the battlefield. Their forces were divided, their attention split between too many points. They were vulnerable. We hit them where they're weakest, I continued, my voice filled with confidence. We take out their leader, and the rest will scatter like rats. Carl frowned. Their leader? Vultan's already dead. Not Vultan, I said, my gaze fixed on the far end of the street, where I could just make out the figure of a man standing in the shadows, watching the battle unfold. The real one. Whoever's been pulling the strings this whole time. Carl followed my gaze, his eyes narrowing. You think that's him?" "I know it is," I replied, my voice cold. "And I'm going to kill him." With that, I leapt from the rooftop, landing with a thud in the street below. The mercenaries turned in shock, their weapons raised, but I didn't give them a chance to react. I was already moving, my sword cutting through the first man's chest before he even knew what had hit him. The rest tried to regroup, but it was too late. I was a whirlwind of steel and death, cutting through them with ease. Carl followed behind, his sword flashing in the dim light as he fought with everything he had left. But my focus was on the man at the far end of the street, the one who had been watching, waiting, guiding the battle from the shadows. He saw me coming now, his eyes widening with fear as he realized his mistake. He had thought he could control me. He had thought he could win. He was wrong. And soon he would pay the price. Chapter 5: The Hunt begins. The shadows of Mordheim closed in around me, thick as smoke. The blood of the mercenaries clung to my armor, their corpses scattered like refuse in the street behind me. But my mind was already elsewhere, locked onto the next prey. I had seen him, the man in the shadows, the true puppet master of this ambush. He had believed himself hidden, safe in the dark while his pawns did the work. He was wrong. The scent of his fear hung in the air, sharper than the stench of blood and rot. It guided me like a beacon through the broken streets of Mordheim. He was running now, trying to escape the inevitable. But there was no escaping me. The hunt had begun, and I would not stop until I had him at my feet, broken and begging for mercy. Carl moved beside me, his breath labored but steady. The mortal had fought bravely, despite the wounds that slowed him. His loyalty was commendable, but his limits were becoming painfully clear. "Who was that man?" Carl asked, wiping blood from his brow. His voice was laced with exhaustion, but there was something else there too: determination. "Someone important," I growled, my eyes locked on the distant figure as it disappeared into the maze of ruins. Someone who thought he could control me. A fool. Carl nodded, understanding. "We going after him?" I glanced at him briefly, noting the way his hand trembled slightly on the hilt of his sword. He was mortal, bound by the weaknesses of flesh and bone. But his will was iron. That much I respected. "Stay close," I said, turning my gaze back to the path ahead. "But if you fall behind, I won't wait." Carl gave me a grim smile. "Wouldn't expect you to." And so we moved, slipping through the ruins like wolves stalking wounded prey. The city's ruins seemed to close in tighter as we advanced, the walls of crumbling buildings towering over us like jagged teeth. The faint light of the shattered comet cast long, twisted shadows across the streets, but I could still sense him, his heart pounding, his breath quickening as he fled deeper into Mordheim. He thought he could outrun me. That was his first mistake. The trail led us through twisting alleys and collapsed thoroughfares, each corner revealing more of the city's decay. Mordheim was a labyrinth of death, its streets littered with the remnants of those who had come before us. Their bones crunched beneath my boots as we pressed forward, my mind focused entirely on the hunt. I could smell him now, closer. The scent of fear, sharp and undeniable, mixed with the sweat of desperation. He was panicking. Good. We rounded a corner, and there he was, a lone figure, hunched and gasping for breath. His cloak was torn, his hands trembling as he struggled to move further into the ruins. But he was out of time. I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Running won't save you." He froze, his back rigid. Slowly he turned to face me, his eyes wide with terror. He was no mercenary, no common sellsword. His clothes, though dirty and torn from the chase, were of finer make. He had the look of a man accustomed to power, but not accustomed to fear. That was clear in the way his eyes darted from me to the ruins around him, searching for some escape that didn't exist. You don't understand," he stammered, his voice trembling. I was only following orders. I stepped closer, my fangs bared in a cruel smile. Then tell me, whose orders were they? He swallowed hard, taking a step back, only to find his back pressed against the cold stone of a ruined wall. There was nowhere left for him to run. He began, but his words were cut off by the sound of Carl's sword scraping against the cobblestones behind me. The man's eyes flicked toward Carl, his expression growing more desperate. I was paid to set the trap, that's all. Please. I didn't know who you were. I laughed, a low, menacing sound that echoed through the narrow alley. Ignorance is no excuse. You knew enough to come after me. I didn't have a choice, he cried, his hands trembling. They threatened me, said they'd kill me if I didn't. Who? I interrupted, my voice cold and sharp. Who threatened you? He hesitated, his eyes darting around, as if the answer might be hidden in the ruins. But there was no escape. He was mine, and he knew it. Please, he begged, his voice breaking. It was a vampire. A lord of the city. I don't know his name, I swear. But he's powerful, more powerful than you can imagine. He controls the streets, the people. I had no choice. A vampire lord. Of course. The pieces began to fall into place. There was more to this city than just madness and ruin. There was power here, power that someone else had already laid claim to. And now they saw me as a threat. Good. Where can I find him? I demanded, my eyes narrowing as I loomed over the man. I don't know, he whimpered, shaking his head frantically. He doesn't show himself. His agents. They control everything from the shadows. He could be anywhere. I stared at him, my mind racing. A rival vampire lord, hidden in the depths of Mordheim, manipulating events from the shadows. It made sense. The mercenaries, the ambush, none of it had been random. It had all been orchestrated, part of a larger plan to eliminate me before I could stake my claim to the city. But I wasn't going anywhere. And what of you? I asked, my voice low. What was your role in all of this? He swallowed hard, his eyes wide with fear. I'm just an intermediary. I handle the contracts, that's all. I didn't even know the target was a vampire. I laughed again, the sound bitter and cold. Then you're a fool. Without another word, I stepped forward, my blade flashing as I struck. The man's scream was cut short as my sword pierced his heart, his body crumpling to the ground at my feet. I turned to Carl, who watched in silence, his expression grim. We're not alone in this city, I said, wiping the blood from my blade. Someone's playing a larger game. A vampire lord who thinks he can manipulate the pieces from the shadows. Carl nodded slowly. And what do we do now? I sheathed my sword, my eyes narrowing as I looked into the distance. The hunt was far from over. This city was mine, and I would tear it apart to find the one who dared challenge me. We hunt, I said, my voice filled with cold resolve. We find this vampire lord, and we make him regret ever crossing me. Mordheim was a game of shadows and blood, and I intended to win.